Eli Hargrove had no plan to stop in Millhaven. That is the first thing you need to understand about this story, because later, when people asked him why he did what he did, the answer was always simpler than they expected. He had no plan, no destination, no particular reason to be anywhere at all. He had ridden out of Oklahoma Territory in February of 1874, 2 weeks after burying Ada Hargrove in the frozen earth behind the house she had fought 30 years to keep, and since that morning he had simply been moving. West mostly, south sometimes, through Texas, across New Mexico territory into Arizona, and eventually north again into Nevada, following no trail except the quiet internal compass of a man who has lost the one person who gave his direction meaning. 6 months of drifting had brought him to Nevada in the first days of August. The heat out here was different from Oklahoma heat. Oklahoma heat had weight to it, a thickness that pressed down on you like a warm hand. Nevada heat was something else entirely. It was indifferent. It did not press. It simply burned clean and absolute, as though the sun had looked down on this stretch of land and decided that mercy was unnecessary. Millhaven sat in a narrow valley between bare Nevada mountains, the kind of mountains that look like they were made in a hurry and never finished. A main street half a mile long, 2 rows of storefronts leaning against each other like tired old men paint long-gone signs warped by wind and seasons. The dirt street was the color of dried blood, deep with hoof prints from the week before. The smell in the morning air was dry grass and horse sweat, and the sharpness of pine wood baked too long under too much sun. 300 people, give or take, if you counted the miners scattered across the surrounding hillsides. 3 saloons, 2 blacksmiths, a Methodist church with a crooked steeple, and Briggs General Store, which sat at the center of Millhaven, the way a courthouse sits at the center of a proper town, because it was the place where everyone came for the things that kept them alive. Eli tied his bay horse Ranger to the hitching rail in front of the store just past midday. He needed ammunition and provisions in that order. He had perhaps $40 left from his last riding job outside Tucson. He intended to buy what he needed, sleep one night in whatever passed for a boarding house in this particular town, and be back on the road by sunrise. He pushed through the door. The bell above it gave a single tired ring, and then the silence came. It was not the ordinary silence of a slow afternoon in a small store. Eli had walked into enough rooms in his life to know the difference. This was the silence of people who had just witnessed something and were deciding how to feel about it. The silence of a crowd drawing back from the edge of something they did not want to be part of. He stopped just inside the doorway. Let his eyes adjust from the white Nevada glare to the dim interior. The store smelled of tobacco and flour and saddle leather and old wood, the accumulated scent of years of daily commerce. Shelves ran along the back wall behind the counter, neat and ordered. Jars of hard candy, bolts of calico cloth in faded blue and rose, tins of Arbuckle's coffee, and there on the middle shelf, 3 boxes of .44 caliber ammunition stacked in a row, each one clearly visible, none of them going anywhere. Eli moved to the corner beside the leftmost shelving unit, quietly, not hiding, just not announcing himself either. It was an old habit from his years riding with the Texas Rangers, the kind of habit that had kept him alive more than once. You enter a room, you find a wall, you watch before you speak. What he saw made him go very still. The woman standing at the counter was perhaps 25 or 26 years old. She was tall for a woman of this time and place, with dark brown hair pulled back from her face in a way that suggested practicality rather than vanity. Her skin was deeply tanned, the tan of someone who worked outdoors in all seasons. Her hands, resting on the edge of the counter, showed the calluses and small scars of a person who knew how to work. She carried a Winchester Model 1873 slung across her back barrel, down the way someone carries a rifle who has been carrying a rifle since childhood and stopped thinking about it long ago. But what Eli noticed first, before any of that, was the color of her skirt. The fabric below her waist had gone dark, not dirty dark, not muddy dark, the deep reddish brown that old blood becomes when it dries in summer heat. It had soaked through the calico in broad patches, the kind of staining that comes from kneeling beside someone, from pressing hands against someone, from cradling someone who had lost far too much before they stopped losing. The blood was not hers. Eli had seen enough battlefields and enough bad mornings on the Texas frontier to understand immediately what that color meant, and more importantly, what it meant that she was standing upright in a general store in the middle of the afternoon wearing it. She had not had time to change. She had not stopped. Whatever had happened, she had gotten back on her horse and ridden straight here, and whatever she needed from this store was the reason. He watched. The man behind the counter was Harold Briggs. Short, soft around the middle hair, parted and pomaded with careful attention. He wore a white apron that had gone yellow with age. His hands were moving on the apron cloth in that repetitive way of a man who is cleaning something that does not need cleaning because his hands need somewhere to be. $5 sat on the countertop between them, their edges catching the thin afternoon light from the front windows. The woman's voice when she spoke was level in a way that Eli recognized immediately. It was the voice of someone who is maintaining control through an act of pure and exhausting will. 3 boxes of 4440, she said. Her father had been shot that morning. The men who did it gave her until tomorrow. They would be back at first light. She set the money down and she asked for what she needed. What Harold Briggs said next, Eli would remember for the rest of his life. He said he could not sell ammunition to a woman. He said it was not proper. He said she might hurt herself or somebody else by accident. He said the words smoothly in the practiced tone of a man who had rehearsed exactly this kind of refusal, who had built a wall of procedure between himself and the moment when doing the right thing might cost him something. Eli looked at the other faces in the store. Dale Whitfield was there, a man of 70 or so, sitting near the back wall. Eli did not know him, but he would learn later that Whitfield had helped Clara's grandfather, Edmund, raise the original barn on the Wade property more than 2 decades before. He was looking at the floor between his boots with great concentration. Agnes Morton stood near the fabric bolts with 2 small children pressed against her skirts. She had moved them gently away from the counter when Clara came in, the way a mother moves her children away from a fire. She was looking at the wall. 3 ranch hands sat around a barrel they had been using for cards. All 3 had found the ceiling suddenly interesting. Nobody looked at the woman in the blood-stained skirt. And then Harold Briggs took the 5 silver dollars she had placed on his counter and slid them back across the wood toward her. He used the very tips of his fingers, the way you might slide something away that you did not want to touch directly. He said the sheriff would be back from Carson City by the end of the week. He said to let the law handle it. The woman said the sheriff was not here. Briggs said perhaps that was the Lord's way of telling her to wait. The silence in the room after that sentence carried a quality that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives, whether they acknowledged it or not. The quality of something shameful that settles into a room and does not leave when the people do. The woman swept the coins off the counter and held them in her palm. She looked around the room at the faces of people who had known her since she was a child, and not one of them met her eyes. Then she said loud enough for every ear in the store, "When they come for your place at next, I hope you remember this afternoon." Nobody answered. The bell rang again when she pushed through the door. This time there was nothing tired about the sound. Eli stood in his corner for a long moment after she left. He looked at Harold Briggs, who was already rearranging things on the counter that did not need rearranging. He looked at the 3 ranch hands who had returned to their card game with a kind of desperate focus. He looked at the 3 boxes of 4440 ammunition sitting on the shelf behind Briggs right there in plain sight, doing nothing. Then he looked at the door. There are moments in a man's life when he knows with absolute clarity what kind of man he is going to be from this point forward. Not who he used to be, not who he intends to become someday. Right now, today, in the next 60 seconds. Eli Hargrove had been many things in his 33 years. He had been a boy watching his mother plow fields in Oklahoma Territory with a broken arm because there was nobody else to do it and the plowing needed to be done. He had been a young man riding with the Texas Rangers, learning how violence worked and when it was necessary and when it was not. He had been a son coming home to nurse a dying woman, setting aside everything else because some things are simply more important than everything else. And he had been, for the past 6 months, a man without direction, moving through a landscape he had no attachment to, waiting without knowing he was waiting. He had not known for what. He settled his hat on his head, pulled the brim low, and walked to the counter. Briggs looked up when Eli approached. His expression shifted slightly the way a man's expression shifts when he believes the next transaction will be easier than the last one. Eli placed both hands flat on the counter. He leaned forward just enough to close the distance between them. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. He would never say publicly what he said to Harold Briggs in that store on that afternoon. But whatever it was enough. The color changed in Briggs's face. His eyes went to the door where Clara Wade was presumably standing outside, and then back to Eli, and then away. Briggs's shoulders dropped half an inch. He turned and took 3 boxes of 44.40 from the shelf. He set them on the counter. He named the price. Eli paid it and put the boxes in a small burlap sack. He walked out of the store. The bell rang above him, sharp and certain. Outside, the Nevada sun hit like an open hand, white and absolute and without apology. She was standing at the hitching rail with her forehead pressed against the neck of her sorrel horse. The horse was dark with sweat from a hard ride flanks, still moving with the effort of whatever miles they had covered since early morning. The animal nickered low when the woman pressed her face into its neck, and its head came around slightly, lips moving against her sleeve in that gesture of comfort that horses offer to the people they belong to. Her shoulders were shaking. She was not making any sound, but her shoulders were shaking with the kind of deep, controlled trembling that comes from someone who has been holding themselves together with nothing but will for hours and who has finally found a moment small enough and private enough to let go of some of what they have been carrying. Through the wavy glass of the store window behind her, Eli could see Harold Briggs still standing at his counter watching. Eli moved to a respectful distance and stopped. He waited. He did not speak. He had learned a long time ago that some things needed to run their course before words became useful, and that a man who interrupts that process to make himself feel less uncomfortable about witnessing someone else's pain is not actually offering comfort. He is only asking to be released from his own discomfort. He waited. After perhaps a minute, she lifted her head. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, a rough and unsentimental gesture. She was not apologizing for the tears. She was simply done with them for now, and she had work to do. She turned and saw him standing there. Her hand moved to the Winchester before she had consciously decided to move it, a reflex so trained and automatic that it had become part of how her body understood the world. Then she stopped. She looked at him. He had already taken his hat off with both hands. He held it at his waist, turning the brim slowly between his fingers. This too was deliberate. A man who takes his hat off and holds it with both hands has made both hands visible and both hands occupied. It is a signal older than language. He said, "Miss, my name is Eli Hargrove. I was inside. I heard everything. I would like to help if you will allow me." She searched his face. Eli had seen that look before on his mother's face and on the faces of other women who had learned through experience that a man's offer of help came with conditions attached more often than not. Conditions sometimes spoken, sometimes not. She was looking for the thing underneath the offer, the assumption, the expectation, the kindness that was actually a claim. She did not find it. What she found instead, if she was looking honestly, was something much simpler and much more difficult to dismiss. A man who was tired in the way of someone who had traveled far and lost much and who had stopped somewhere in that traveling and decided that he was not willing to watch something unjust happen in front of him without doing anything about it. Not because he expected anything in return, not because she was a woman and he was a man, but because there are moments when the difference between standing and walking away is the difference between who you are and who you only thought you were. She said, "Why?" One word. But the way she said it told him that she had asked this question many times and received answers that turned out to be wrong, and she was asking it again because she needed the truth, even if the truth was not what she wanted to hear. He told her about Ada. He told her that his mother had run their property in Oklahoma Territory alone after his father died in a cattle stampede. He had been 10 years old, 2 younger sisters. Ada Hargrove had kept that land for 8 years before she remarried through drought and doubt and the cruelty of neighbors who believed that a woman in a skirt had no business trying to do what Ada was doing. He had watched men twice his mother's size speak to her the way adults speak to children they have decided are not worth taking seriously. He had watched her smile politely and then go back to work harder than any of them. She had been the strongest person he had ever known. She had died in January. Pneumonia took her fast. His sisters were both married, settled in other places. There was nothing left in Oklahoma worth going back for. He told her he had been drifting since January. He told her he had thought he was looking for work. He said that standing in that store and listening to Harold Briggs push her money back across the counter, and then listening to her walk out of that building alone, he had understood something that he had not been able to name until that moment. He was not looking for work. He was looking for a reason to stop. He looked at the blood-stained skirt. He looked at the Winchester on her shoulder. He looked at her eyes, which were still wet at the corners, but clear in the center. The eyes of someone who has already made peace with the fact that today is going to be hard and has decided to be hard right back. He said no one should have to face what you are facing alone, and no one should be told they cannot buy what they need to protect what is theirs just because of what they wear. She was quiet for a long time. The street of Millhaven was nearly empty in the afternoon heat. A stray dog nosed along the base of the hardware store. Far down toward the livery stable, a wagon moved slowly through the dust, its empty crates rattling. The sun pressed down on everything without mercy. From inside the store, Eli knew Briggs was still watching. He could feel it the way you feel eyes on the back of your neck. Clara Wade looked at the burlap sack in his hand. Then she looked at his face again, searching for whatever she still needed to find before she could make a decision. Then she looked north up the road that led out of Millhaven, where the dust from 7 horses had not entirely settled from that morning. 7 riders who had come down from the Crane property just before sunrise and returned after. 7 sets of tracks in the red dirt, deep and deliberate, and not in any hurry. She held out her hand. He gave her the sack. She opened it, looked at the 3 boxes inside, closed it again. She looked up at him. She said, "I am going to pay you back every cent." He said, "I know." She said, "How much do I owe you?" He said, $1.20. She said, "I will pay you back at the ranch when this is over." He said, "I believe you." 3 words, no condition attached. No, but if you can, no, whenever you are able. No, do not worry about it. Just, I believe you. She held the sack against her chest and looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at his horse Ranger tied 2 posts down from her own horse at the rail. The bay was quiet, standing easy in the heat, ears moving slowly in the way of a horse that has covered a great many miles and learned patience from the doing of it. She said, "You can ride with me if you want." She said it the same way someone might say it is not raining right now, which means she was not offering anything except the simple fact of a road and 2 people who happened to be going in the same direction at the same time. He untied Ranger from the rail. They rode north out of Millhaven together without looking back. The road narrowed to a single wagon track of red dust winding between low hills of sagebrush. The afternoon sun was still high and fierce, turning the air above the ground into something that shimmered at the edges. The mountains in the distance were blue and remote, the kind of distance that means nothing is close and everything is far. They rode in silence for the first 10 minutes. Eli kept Ranger on her right side without being asked. He had done this automatically, the way you do things that have been trained into your body until they become reflex. Ride on the right of the person you are with, between them and the open ground. It is an old custom of men who have learned that protection, when it is needed, rarely announces itself in advance. She noticed. He saw her notice. But she did not say anything about it. He was the one who broke the silence. He looked down at the ground ahead of them and said, 7 horses this morning. They came in easy, rode out slow. No concern about being followed. The second horse from the right was heavy-shod, deeper print than the others. Man is big or carrying extra weight. Third print from the left shows a drag spur, the kind you see on long riders who work large spreads, not drifters. She looked at him. He said, 3 years with the Texas Rangers before I went home to take care of my mother. You learn to read the ground. She said nothing for a moment. The horses moved at a steady walk, their hooves making a soft percussion on the packed, red earth. Then she said, you left the Rangers to go home to her. He said yes. She said no regrets. The questions sat in the air between them, while a hawk made slow circles overhead and the sagebrush moved in the faint warm wind coming off the mountains. He said no. There are no regrets. Not I have no regrets. Not I would do it again. Just no. Simple and complete, the way a man speaks when he has already examined a question from every available angle and arrived somewhere beyond the need to justify the answer. She absorbed that. They rode on. 15 miles is a long way in the August Nevada heat, with the sun at that westward angle that makes the light go amber and the shadows go long. The road climbed gradually out of the valley floor, following the line of a dry creek bed that had not seen running water since late spring. The air smelled of baking earth and distant pine and the mineral sharpness of the high desert. Clara Wade rode without speaking and without looking at him much, which told him she was thinking. He let her think. He had learned long ago that the most useful thing you can do for someone who is carrying something heavy is not to talk them out of carrying it, but to simply be present while they do. He thought about what he knew so far. Victor Crane. He had heard the name in Millhaven before he even walked into the store, mentioned in the tone of voice that means a man has accumulated enough power in one place to make people speak carefully when his name comes up. Crane had been buying land in this valley for 5 years, not always buying, sometimes pressuring, sometimes worse. The family named Burke had lost their place 3 years back after their well went bad overnight. The Shaw family lost their barn to fire the following winter, a fire called lightning, by everyone except the people who had stood outside and watched it burn with no storm in the sky. The Vega family had simply left in the middle of the night, and their youngest child had been found sitting in the road the next morning, repeating a single sentence his father had told him to say, if anyone asked, "Run when you see the torches." And Frank Wade had not signed. He had not signed this morning when Crane's 7 riders came down to the Wade property before sunrise. He had not signed, and they had shot him on his own front porch, and now his daughter was riding north with blood-stained skirts and a sack of 44-40 ammunition purchased by a stranger, and tomorrow morning those same 7 riders would come back. Eli thought about all of this while the miles passed under Ranger's hooves. He thought about his mother, Ada. He thought about the men who had come to her with their offers and their condescension and their absolute certainty that a woman alone was a woman who would eventually give in. He thought about watching her plow a field with a broken arm, not because she was trying to prove something, but because the field needed plowing, and she was the only one there to do it. He thought about the years and the weight of them, and the way Ada had never let that weight bend her into a shape that was not her own. He thought about a woman who had ridden 15 miles with her father's blood on her dress to buy ammunition that no one in town would sell her, and about a storekeeper who had slid money back across a counter with the tips of his fingers. He thought, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. The ranch appeared below them as they crested the last ridge before the valley of Clearwater Creek. It was a view that opened the way a room opens when someone pulls back a curtain, sudden and full, and somehow larger than expected. The house was 2 stories of weathered pine gone silver gray with age. A kitchen garden behind it showed green, even in August heat, fed by the creek. The barn stood solid under cottonwood trees built the way things were built by men who expected their grandchildren to use it. Every board fitted true. 30 head of cattle grazed in the home pasture, heads, low tails working against the flies of late afternoon. Beyond the house on the rise behind it, a single cottonwood tree stood taller than all the others. Beneath it was a simple wooden cross, and beside that cross a rectangle of dark bare earth. The earth had been turned recently. Eli understood without being told that the grave was waiting. Clara did not look at it as they rode down. She looked at the house. She looked at the porch, and even from this distance, Eli could see the dark color of the floorboards on one section of it, the color that meant she had not yet been able to bring herself to wash away what was there. She said his name was Frank. He was 58 years old. My grandfather Edmund came to this land in 1851 with 8 men who were going to build something. 7 of them left or died. Edmund stayed because he decided the land was worth staying for. Frank stayed because Edmund stayed. And I stayed because Frank stayed. She stopped talking. She did not say anything else about it. They buried Frank Wade in the last hour of afternoon light, when the sun was low enough to paint the mountains and the cottonwood leaves in the deep gold that Nevada does once a day and never repeats exactly. Eli dug the grave without being asked. He had done this kind of work before, the quiet work of burial, and he knew that the way to do it was simply to do it without ceremony and without commentary, because the person standing nearby watching does not need words from a stranger. They need the task completed with dignity. He dug straight and deep. Clara stood a few feet away with her arms folded across her chest, watching. She was not crying now. She had already given that to the sorrel horse's neck back in Millhaven. What she had now was the harder face that comes after tears, the face of someone recalibrating, counting what remains. When the grave was ready, they lowered Frank together, Eli at the shoulders, Clara at the feet. The blue quilt that Ruth Wade had made by hand wrapped tight around the man inside it. The stitching, visible even now, neat and patient, the work of a woman's care preserved long after the woman herself was gone. When the quilt touched the earth at the bottom of the grave, Clara knelt at the edge. She pressed one hand against the fabric. She said, "Papa, you taught me to be strong, to ride straight, to shoot true, to hold what is ours. I will make you proud, I swear it." The wind moved through the cottonwood above them. The leaves made a sound like very light applause, or like whispering the kind that does not have specific words. Eli stood one step behind her with his hat over his heart. He did not speak. He did not try to fill the silence with anything. Some silences are not empty. Some silences are where the important things live, and filling them is not a kindness. When she reached for the shovel, he handed it to her. When she needed to stop for a moment, he took it from her without a word and worked until she was ready again. They filled the grave together as the sky above the valley moved through purple into the first dark of evening. Eli took his knife and carved the name into a length of pine branch. Frank Wade. No dates, no inscription, just the name cut deep so it would last through seasons. He drove it into the earth at the head of the mound. They stood there a moment longer in the cooling air, listening to the creak and the last birds of evening and the distant lowing of the cattle settling for the night. Then Eli put his hat back on and said quietly, "We should get back. There is work to do before it is fully dark." Clara nodded. They walked down the hill together, their boots scuffing through the dry grass, their shadows going long ahead of them in the last light. The work before dark was the work of preparation, and it was done without discussion. Eli went through the guns the way a man goes through them when he knows the guns will matter tomorrow. He checked each action, each chamber, each load. 3 rifles along the wall, 2 shotguns above the mantel, 4 revolvers in the drawer. He worked through them methodically the way the Rangers had taught him, not rushing, because rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes with firearms led to outcomes that could not be undone. Clara set the 3 boxes of 44-40 on the table, and they divided the ammunition between the weapons. She knew exactly what she was doing. Her hands were quick and sure. She had been doing this since she was 12 years old. When the guns were ready, she made supper from what was left in the kitchen. Venison stew that Frank had put on to simmer 2 days ago, thick with potato and carrot, still good. A heel of bread gone hard from sitting but edible when you needed to eat. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low, and they talked about Crane. She told him everything. Burke, Shaw, Vega. The pattern of it, the years of it, the way Crane operated by choosing targets carefully and making each act of destruction look like something that could not be attributed to him. The well that went bad overnight. The lightning that picked one building and left everything else standing. The family that simply vanished in the dark. And Frank. Frank, who had refused for years, who had watched it happen to his neighbors, and still refused, who had kept something of his own through all of it. Eli listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I know the type. Saw it in Texas. Men who believe land belongs to whoever can hold it longest or frighten everyone else off it first." He pushed his bowl aside, half finished. The stew had gone tasteless somewhere in the conversation. Then she put the letter on the table between them. She had found it upstairs, she said, while Eli was cooking. She had gone to her father's room to sit with the absence of him for a moment, and she had seen the old Winchester on the wall. Edmund's rifle, the one nobody ever used anymore. Frank cleaned it sometimes on Saturday evenings, she said. A habit from his own father. She had taken it down. She had felt resistance in the action when she worked the lever, something in the barrel. She had pushed it out, and it had fallen into her lap. A small roll of paper tied with a leather cord, Frank's handwriting, Frank's ink, Frank's careful, deliberate penmanship, the penmanship of a man who had taken his time. 3 pages. Eli read them in the lamplight without speaking. He read the first page through, then the second, then the third, and then he went back and read the first page again more slowly. Clara watched his face. She had already read all of it and was watching to see what he understood. What he understood was considerable. The first page was a list, dates, locations, names of witnesses. Each family that Crane had destroyed was there with specific details that only someone who had been watching carefully and recording faithfully could have gathered. A witness named Jesse Alderman, currently in Reno, who had seen one of Crane's men at the Burke Well on the night of March 8, 1871. A sketch of horse tracks from the night of the Shaw barn fire, showing the approach from the direction of Crane's property. A letter received by the Vega family, handwritten and unsigned, identified by the paper stock as the kind that Harold Briggs imported, specially from San Francisco. The second page was a map. The real boundaries of the Wade property according to the original 1851 land grant compared to the boundaries Crane had been claiming. A difference of more than 20 acres on the north side, precisely the section that followed Clearwater Creek. And a named Douglas Reed, the county land registrar, who had altered the official survey maps in 1869 in exchange for a payment from Crane. And the third page was a letter to Clara. Eli read it and was quiet for a long time after. Daughter of mine, if you are reading this, then I am not there to say it directly, and I am sorry for that. I have known for some time that Crane would come. I knew it after the Shaw barn. I have been keeping what I know in this rifle because it is the last place Crane would ever look, and because I needed to be sure I had enough to matter before I gave it to anyone. This is enough. Take it to Sheriff Garrett when he comes back. Take it to a proper lawyer if you can find one. This is what you need to put Victor Crane in front of a judge. Then there was a space, and below the space in slightly smaller letters, as though added later, as though it had taken longer to decide to write. I taught you one thing wrong, Clara. I told you strength was standing alone. Your mother understood something I never fully learned. She could ask for help and not lose herself in the asking. If there is someone worth standing beside, do not push them away just because I raised you to stand alone. That was my limitation, not yours. Eli set the pages down carefully on the table. He looked at the lamp flame for a moment. He said your father was a smart man. He knew he probably was not going to get out of this. He wanted to make sure that what happened to him was not the end of the story. Clara said softly, he told me to go check the east fence. Eli looked at her. She said this morning, before they came. He sent me away. He told me to go check the east fence because there were some cattle straying in that direction. He looked at me when he said it, and he smiled. I did not understand the smile. The lamp flame moved slightly in a draft from the window crack. She said he knew. He was sitting on that porch with his coffee going cold, and he already knew what was coming, and he sent me away because he did not want me there when it happened. Eli said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be adequate to what she had just understood, and he had enough wisdom to know it. Some things you simply have to let a person sit inside for a moment before life moves forward again. After a while, she folded the 3 pages and put them back inside her dress, close against her chest. Eli said we should decide watches. I will take the first 2 hours. She said, wake me after. He said yes. She climbed the stairs. He heard her settle into the room above him. He turned the lamp lower until it was barely a thread of light enough to see the yard through the front window, but not enough to be visible from outside. He set his rifle across his knees and positioned his chair so he could see both the front window and the door to the back of the house. The night outside was enormous and dark and full of Nevada stars. The creek made its sound down in the cottonwoods. Somewhere above the ranch, a night bird called once and then was quiet. The smell of smoke had been coming on the north wind since around 11 o'clock. Not the smell of a campfire, not the clean smell of pine burning in a stove. A different kind of smoke. The kind that comes from a sustained fire kept going deliberately over many hours to keep multiple people warm through a cold desert night. They were already out there. Eli sat with his rifle and listened to the dark and did not sleep. Around 2 in the morning, he heard her come down the stairs. Her footsteps were quiet but not silent, the footsteps of someone who had grown up in this house and knew which boards talked. She came into the kitchen with her own rifle and sat down across the table from him without being asked. In the faint light, her eyes were dry and clear. She said, Eli. It was the first time she had used his name. He noticed the difference. She said, have you ever shot someone? He was quiet for a moment. He said, yes. She said, did you sleep after? He looked at the dark beyond the window for a moment before he answered. He said, not the first night. Not for a good many nights after that either. Eventually I slept again, but it was not the same kind of sleeping as before. It never quite goes back to what it was. She was listening carefully the way she had listened to everything he said, with her full attention, without filling the spaces between sentences. He said, I cannot prepare you for how it will feel. No words will do that. But I can tell you this much. Protecting what belongs to you, protecting your own life. That is not the same thing as the other kind. That does not make it easy, but it is not the same. She nodded once, not agreeing exactly. More acknowledging that she had heard him, that she would carry the words with her into whatever the morning brought. They sat together in the low light as the hours moved slowly toward dawn. The smell of smoke on the north wind grew gradually stronger. Neither of them mentioned it. They both knew. Outside, somewhere in the dark hills north of the ranch, 7 horses were standing at a campfire, and the men who had ridden them were waiting for the sky to go gray. The last night of the only life Clara Wade had ever known was almost over. And in the kitchen of the house her grandfather had built, with the letter her father had left her pressed against her heart, she sat across from a man who had come to Millhaven with no plan and no destination and no reason to stop. He had stopped anyway, because some things are worth stopping for, and some debts are paid not in dollars, but in the simple fact of being present, when presence is the only thing that matters. The stars outside began to fade. The east began to show the first colorless gray of Nevada dawn. Clara Wade tightened her hand around the Winchester in her lap and waited for what was coming. The first light of a Nevada morning does not come in gold or red. It comes in gray. A flat, colorless gray that seeps in from the east like water, finding its level, turning the black of night into the pale nothing of early dawn. The mist sits low in the valley, threading through the cottonwoods along Clearwater Creek, pooling in the low places of the yard. The temperature drops in the last hour before sunrise, the desert giving back all the heat it borrowed from the day before, and the cold of it is sharp and clean and without sentiment. Clara was at the front window when the light began to change. She had been there for the better part of an hour. One hand braced against the window frame, the other wrapped around the forestock of her Winchester. The glass was cold under her palm. Outside the cottonwoods dripped with dew, their leaves hanging heavy and still. The yard was silver and gray and quiet in the pre-dawn, the barn casting a long shadow across the ground that had been her grandfather's ground and her father's ground, and was now for however long she could hold it hers. Eli was at the side window rifle resting across the frame, watching the northern approach. He had been in that position for 30 minutes without moving in any way that was not necessary. He was the stillest man she had ever observed, the kind of stillness that does not come from patience in the ordinary sense, but from long practice in situations where movement at the wrong moment cost you something you could not get back. Neither of them had slept in the final hours before dawn. The smoke smell on the north wind had grown heavier as the night went on, until by 3 in the morning, it was no longer possible to pretend it was anything other than what it was. Men keeping themselves warm through a cold desert night. Men who had no intention of leaving before the thing they came for was finished. Clara had said nothing about it. There was nothing to say. She watched the road, and then she heard them. The sound came before the sight the way it always does in open country. The rhythmic compression of hooves on packed earth moving at a walk deliberate and unhurried. The sound of men who knew they were expected and had decided that haste was beneath them. The sound of people who had done this kind of thing before. A thin line of dust rose on the northern road, pale against the gray sky, catching the first faint light of morning. Eli said without turning his head, "They are here." Clara said nothing. Her hand tightened on the Winchester until the wood creaked faintly under her grip. 7 riders came out of the mist in a loose line, moving at a steady trot that became a walk as they approached the gate. The fog clung to the legs of the horses and made them look as though they were floating half-dream shapes emerging from something that was not quite the waking world. At their head was a man on a black gelding, silver threading through his dark hair, riding with the easy posture of someone who has been on horseback so long that it no longer requires any thought at all. Victor Crane wore a dark vest over a clean white shirt. A clean white shirt Clara noticed at 6 in the morning after camping in the open desert. This was deliberate. Everything about Victor Crane was deliberate. The shirt was a message. It said, "I can be comfortable under any circumstances." It said, "This is not difficult for me." It said, "You are the one who is frightened, not me." 6 men fanned out behind him as they stopped 50 yards from the house. Hard faces, rifles across saddles, eyes moving over the windows, in the roofline, with the practiced attention of men who assess locations for tactical purpose without having to think about it consciously. These were not hired cowboys who had gotten in over their heads. These were men Crane paid to be exactly what they were. The mist swirled around their horses. Crane's voice carried easily in the still morning air, the way voices carry in cold desert before the wind comes up and breaks the silence into pieces. He said her name, Clara Wade. 2 syllables, flat and declarative, the way you announce something that is already decided. Clara felt the sound of it in her chest. She drew a slow breath. She moved to the doorway, keeping herself behind the frame. The Winchester angled low but ready. She stepped half into view. Crane lifted his chin. He said her father had made a foolish choice. He said she had 1 hour. He said to take what she could carry, leave the signed deed on the porch, and walk away clean. He said that was the offer. She looked at the dark stain on the porch boards 10 feet to her left. Frank's blood dried into the grain of the wood still there, because she had not been able to bring herself to clean it, and because some part of her understood that cleaning it away before this was settled would be a kind of surrender she was not yet ready to make. She stepped fully into the doorway. Her voice was steadier than she had expected it to be. She told him her father had been right to refuse. She told him this was Wade land and always would be. She told him he had murdered her father in cold blood and she intended to see him hang for it. Low laughter from the riders behind Crane. Not loud. The quiet laughter of men who have witnessed this particular scene before and know how it ends. Crane's expression was patient, almost sympathetic. He said the sheriff was not here. He said she was one woman alone. He said she should be reasonable. And then Eli stepped out. He did not hurry. He moved to the doorway and took his position beside her with the same economy of motion he brought to everything. And when he raised his rifle, the barrel was level and still and aimed at the center of Victor Crane's chest as though it had always been going to rest exactly there. He said, "She is not alone." 4 words, delivered in a voice that had no theater in it, no performance, no effort to impress. Just a statement of observable fact, the same way you might say, the sky is clear or the creek is running. Something happened to Victor Crane's face. It was small and it was fast, and Clara doubted anyone in Crane's party saw it. But she was standing 18 inches away from Eli Hargrove, and she had her eyes on Crane, and she saw it. The brief involuntary adjustment of a man whose calculation has just been altered by a variable he did not plan for. His eyes moved to Eli and sharpened. He said he did not know this cowboy. He said this was not his fight. He told Eli to ride out while he still had the chance. Eli said, "I am making it my fight." He said it without any of the tension that usually lives in those words when men say them to each other in situations like this. It came out almost quiet, almost conversational. The tone of a man stating a position he has already thought through and is not going to reconsider. Then he said something that moved through Crane's hired men like a current through still water. He said he had ridden with the Texas Rangers for 3 years before he went home to care for his mother. He said he knew the difference between land in legitimate dispute and land taken through fear and destruction. He said he had seen the kind of man Crane was often enough to know how those men usually ended when the chain of fear they had built their power on finally broke at a link they had not expected. A murmur ran through the riders. One man leaned toward the man beside him. 2 others exchanged a look. The Texas Rangers had a reputation that extended far beyond Texas, a reputation built over decades of specific, undocumented outcomes for specific, undocumented types of men. Crane raised one hand, a sharp and practiced command. The murmur stopped. He said 1 hour, his voice still controlled. He wheeled the black gelding and his men spread out to wait at the perimeter of the property, positioning themselves at the distances that experienced men choose when they are preparing for something and want options. Clara let out a breath that had been waiting for somewhere to go. Her hands were trembling, fine and small and entirely beyond her control. She lowered the Winchester a fraction and looked at Eli. She said, "You rode with the Texas Rangers." He kept his eyes on the riders in the field. He said, "For a while." She said, "You did not mention that before." He said, "It did not seem important." She said, "You did not tell me because you wanted me to trust who you are. Not what you used to be." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "Gone before it was fully there." He said something like that. 15 minutes later, someone knocked on the door. Not the knock of men arriving to take something. The careful, considered knock of someone who wants to be heard without being shot. Eli checked through the side window. He looked at Clara. He said, "Crane. 1 man. No gun that I can see." She said, "A trap." He said, "Possible. Or he wants to say something his men are not supposed to hear." They opened the door but did not step outside. Crane stood on the porch with his hands held slightly away from his body, the universal signal of a man who is communicating. "I have not come here for this particular kind of confrontation." Up close, he was different from the figure on horseback. The silver in his hair was more pronounced. The lines in his face were deeper. These were not the lines of weather and sun. They were the lines of a man who had been making hard calculations for a long time and had not slept easily because of it. He said he had not come to negotiate. He said, I came to explain one thing, once, and then I will go back. Clara said nothing. Crane looked past her briefly, then back. He said that in 1857, when he was 19 years old, his father had lost their property in Kansas. 30 years of building gone in 4 months. Drought and debt, and a bank that followed the letter of the law to the last comma. The man who took the property was not a villain. He was simply doing his job within the system as the system existed. He said, I made a decision that day that what happened to my father would never happen to me, that I would accumulate enough land that no drought and no bank and no change in the law could ever take it away. I did not care very much at 19 years old about the methods. I cared about the result. Clara listened. She was careful to listen because she had been raised by a man who believed you understand your enemy by understanding his logic, not by dismissing it. Then she spoke. She said you lost land when you were 19. I understand that pain. I am standing in it right now, but that pain did not give you the right to poison the Burke well. It did not give you the right to burn the Shaw barn with no storm in the sky. It did not give you the right to threaten a 9-year-old child until his father told him to run if he ever saw torches coming. She said it quietly, without the anger that might have been expected because she had used up her anger somewhere in the long night behind her, and what was left was something harder and cleaner. She said, and it did not give you the right to shoot my father on his own porch. Crane looked at her for a long moment. He did not deny any of it. He did not claim innocence or misunderstanding. He simply looked at her with the expression of a man who has received the answer he already knew he was going to receive and has decided to stop pretending otherwise. He said, I just wanted you to know it was not simple. She said, what part of shooting a man on his own porch is not simple? No answer. He turned and walked back down the porch steps without another word. The sound of his boots on the boards. The sound of his horse as he mounted. The sound of him returning to his men who had been watching from the edges of the property waiting. Clara stood in the doorway and watched him go. She did not feel what she had expected to feel after that conversation. She had expected relief or disgust, or perhaps a clarifying anger. What she felt instead was a kind of sadness she could not fully name. The sadness of understanding something about the world that would have been better not to understand. Eli said softly he wanted something from that conversation. She said he wanted me to see myself in him. Eli said nothing. She said, I see the difference. The hour ran out in the way that hours do when you are waiting for something terrible. Not slowly in the way of waiting rooms and long journeys. In the compressed rush of time that accelerates when you want it to stop, when each minute that passes is a minute of ordinary life ending and not returning. They were at the windows when the men at the perimeter began to move. 2 of Crane's riders broke away from the others and rode toward the barn at an angle that kept the barn between themselves and the house for as long as possible. They were not subtle about what they were doing because they had no reason to be subtle. They carried bundles of dry sagebrush across their saddles, the kind that burns fast and hot and carries fire up a wooden wall with enthusiasm. Eli said they will fire the barn first. When you go out to fight the fire, the men at the perimeter open up on the house. She said we stop them before the fire catches. He raised his rifle to the window frame and fired one careful shot that kicked up dust 6 inches in front of the nearest man's horse. A warning precise and unambiguous. The man pulled his horse back. The second man did not stop. He was already at the base of the barn wall, already crouching over his bundle of sagebrush. And when he struck the match, the flame took the dry material, immediately yellow and hungry, and within seconds the fire was climbing the base of the barn wall with a crackling sound that Clara could hear from inside the house. The 4 riders at the perimeter opened fire. The sound of it was enormous in the morning quiet, glass exploding inward from the windows, wood splintering along the frame of the front door, a slug punching through the wall to Clara's left and sending plaster dust into the air in a white cloud. She dropped below the window level, ears ringing, then came back up and fired twice through the opening. Eli returned fire from the side window. Methodical. One shot assessed one shot. He had the economy of a man who had been taught to shoot, not to make noise, but to create specific outcomes. One of the perimeter riders grabbed his upper arm and his horse shied sideways. The man stayed mounted, which told Clara the wound was not serious, which meant she needed to do something about the fire, before the man at the barn added another bundle to what was already burning. She raised the Winchester to the window. The man at the barn wall was crouching to reach into his saddlebag for more material. He was 20 yards away, close enough that Clara could see the details of him. The worn heel of his left boot, the way his shoulders hunched against the morning cold, the young set of his jaw. He looked up. She almost did not fire. In the fraction of a second when the face turned toward her and the features resolved out of the general shape of a man into something specific and particular, she felt her finger hesitate on the trigger in a way it had never hesitated before. Not from fear, from recognition. 23 years old, dark eyes wide with something between focus and something that was not quite fear. Dust on his face from the night's riding, and beneath the dust, beneath the morning grime, a face she had seen before, a face she had grown up seeing. Tommy Burke, Martin and Eleanor Burke's oldest son, the family that Victor Crane had destroyed 3 years ago when the well went bad. Tommy, who had spent a summer helping her father with the hay harvest when Claire was 17. Tommy, whose mother and her mother had traded eggs and preserves for years before Ruth Wade died. Tommy, who had lost his own father to a sickness that came on the heels of losing everything else. The kind of sickness that lives in a man's chest long before it shows up anywhere a doctor can find. Tommy Burke, on his knees at the base of the barn, Edmund Wade had built with his own hands with a lit match and a bundle of sagebrush, working for the man who had ruined his family. The fire behind him was already 4 feet up the barn wall. Her finger found the trigger. She had one clear second to aim, and she made the choice that she would spend 40 years carrying with her, and she took it. The shot was not aimed to kill. It caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him away from the barn wall and dropping him hard into the red dirt of the yard. His hat rolled away from his head. He lay still, face down, a dark stain spreading rapidly through the back of his shirt. Clara stared at her own hands. The Winchester was still raised. Her hands were white on the stock. Then the perimeter fire intensified, and she had no more time for anything except the work in front of her. What happened next occupied perhaps 20 minutes in real time. In memory, it would always seem both longer and shorter than that, the way things do when they are happening at a speed that the ordinary mind was not built to process. Eli moved through it with a precision that Clara would not fully appreciate until afterward. 2 shots that found their targets and kept 2 more riders from reaching the house. 1 shot that clipped the hat off a man who was too close to the barn and drove him back long enough for the fire to slow its spread without additional fuel. He placed each round with the economy of a man who counts what he has and knows the difference between what is enough and what is gone. The fire on the barn wall climbed regardless. By the time the perimeter riders had pulled back to regroup after losing 2 men to wounds, the barn was committed. The lower third of the east wall was fully involved, the fire moving up the old dry boards with a hunger that 40 years of desert sun had made possible. The smell of it reached Clara through the broken windows, sharp and acrid, and underneath it, something she had not expected. The smell of memory. The smell of 40 years of her grandfather's work and her father's work and the accumulated seasons of everything they had built, releasing itself into the morning air and smoke. Eli's final shot of the engagement came when Victor Crane rode forward from his position at the edge of the property, either to better direct his men or perhaps because the situation had moved beyond what he could manage from a distance. The shot was deliberate and placed with care, and it caught Crane in the left thigh. The sound that came out of Victor Crane was not what Clara expected from a man who had presented himself as composed and deliberate and above the ordinary reactions of ordinary men. It was raw and unguarded and entirely human. He lurched in the saddle, grabbing at the wound with both hands, blood pouring through his fingers in a dark and immediate flood. The black gelding felt the sudden disorganization of the man on its back and shied hard to the right, and Crane slid sideways, his left foot catching in the stirrup, dragging a few feet over the ground before the boot tore free and he fell. He lay on his side in the dirt of the property he had come to take, pressing his hands against his thigh, his face gone the color of the dust around him. Eli stood in the doorway. He said loudly and clearly, in a voice that carried to every man still on a horse in that field, "Your employer is bleeding out. That wound will kill him in 2 hours without a doctor. Ask yourselves whether this land is worth dying for." The silence that followed was total. It broke when the youngest of the 7 riders threw his rifle to the ground. The clatter of it against the rocks was startlingly loud. Then there was only the sound of fire-eating wood and the horses moving uneasily and the distant calling of birds disturbed by the noise. The young man said, "I am done. I did not sign on to kill people for dirt." He was barely 20. The words came out in a voice that had not fully decided whether it was a man's voice yet. Two of the other riders dropped their weapons and raised their hands. Three more turned their horses and rode hard in the direction they had come from, dust rising behind them until the sound of hooves faded into the distance. The young man remained. He began the difficult work of getting Victor Crane onto a horse. Crane was conscious but fading, his instructions reduced to curses that grew quieter as his blood pressure dropped. The young man worked steadily, struggling with the weight of a man who could not help with the process of moving himself, and he did not look toward the house until Crane was draped across the saddle and secured. Then he looked. He looked directly at Clara standing in the doorway with her rifle across her forearm. And he said something that made her go very still. He said, "My name is Seth Holloway. My grandfather was Martin Burke. The family whose well Victor Crane poisoned 3 years ago was my family. That well went bad the night after Crane's man stood in our yard and we turned him down." His voice was not asking for anything. Not absolution, not sympathy, just putting the fact in the air where it belonged. He said, "I took this job because I had 3 younger siblings and no other way to feed them. I know that is not a good enough reason, but it is the true reason." Clara looked at him, at the young face under the dust, carrying the weight of a name that Crane had spent 3 years trying to erase from the valley. She said, "Go, Seth. Make sure he reaches the doctor." He looked at her for a moment longer. Something moved through his expression that she could not name exactly. Then he touched the brim of his hat, once slow and deliberate, in the manner of a man making a formal acknowledgement. He turned his horse and rode toward Millhaven, with Victor Crane across the saddle, the dust rising slow behind them in the early morning air. The barn was gone. It did not fall dramatically. It went the way old things go when fire finds them thoroughly enough it's settled. The walls leaned inward, the roof joist gave way, the structure that had stood through 40 Nevada winters and 40 cycles of drought and flood simply gave up its arrangement of matter and became something else. A column of black smoke rose straight into the windless morning air and climbed until it was visible. Clara knew from Millhaven and from the ridge lines in every direction. She sank to her knees on the porch, not from weakness, from the simple fact that her legs had been holding her for a very long time and they needed a moment to stop. The crying came the way it had come at the hitching rail in Millhaven the day before, without announcement and without apology. Not the crying of someone who has broken. The crying of someone who has held together under extraordinary pressure and who, now that the pressure has relented by a few degrees, is releasing what the body accumulated in the holding. It was the crying of grief and relief and exhaustion and the weight of having done something irrevocable and knowing it would be part of her for the rest of her life. She cried for the barn, for the 40 years of her family's hands in every board of it, and for the fact that a thing her grandfather had built in the year 1851 no longer existed in the world. She cried for Frank, whose absence had been a fact she had been managing since morning and had not fully allowed herself to feel yet. She cried for Tommy Burke lying in the dirt of the yard with her bullet in his shoulder. She cried for Seth Holloway riding away with the man who had ruined his family, because that was the only thing he had been able to find to do. Eli knelt beside her immediately. His right arm, the uninjured one, came around her shoulders. Not possessive, not performative. Firm and steady, the way a wall is firm, and steady the way anything reliable is, not through force, but through simple, inconsistent presence. She turned into him and pressed her face against his chest and let herself cry the way she had not let herself cry since she had found Frank on the porch boards that morning. He held her through it without speaking. His chin rested lightly on the top of her head. He did not offer empty comfort. He did not say it would be all right, because he was a man who did not say things he could not back with evidence. He simply held her while the smoke rose from the ruins of her grandfather's barn and the morning light moved across the valley, and he let the moment be what it was. After a while, her breathing evened out. The shuddering in her shoulders slowed and stopped. She said into the fabric of his shirt, "My grandfather built that barn in 1851. He was one of 8 men who came here together. 7 of them left or died. He stayed because he decided this land was worth staying for. He put up that barn with his own hands as the first real thing. The first thing that made the decision permanent." Eli's arm tightened a fraction. She said now it is ash. He did not tell her it could be rebuilt. Not in that moment. He understood that she was not asking to be consoled. She was bearing witness to what had been lost, which is a different and necessary thing, and it required presence rather than problem solving. After a long moment, he said quietly, "We still have the house. We are still alive. That is where we start." She pulled back slightly and looked at his face. There was blood on his shirt collar, dried and dark from the shoulder wound he had not mentioned. She had noticed it during the fighting and done nothing about it because there was nothing to be done during the fighting, and now she saw it fresh, the reminder of how much could have gone differently in the past hour. She tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her underskirt without ceremony and wrapped his shoulder. He let her work. The wound was shallow, a furrow rather than a penetration, but it needed pressure and it needed cleaning. He said, while she worked, "We need to talk about what I found in your father's letter." She said, "I know." She had not forgotten. She had been carrying the letter against her chest through all of it, its 3 pages folded close to her heart, the words her father had written in the lamplight of his own careful preparation pressing against her ribs with every breath. She said, "Harold Briggs." He said, "Yes." She had read the name on the first page of her father's letter the night before, and had not fully processed it in the hours that followed because there had been other things requiring her full attention. But now, with the smoke still rising and the yard gone quiet, and the immediate violence of the morning resolved into its aftermath, she let herself sit with it. H. Briggs, July 14th, 1874. Harold Briggs had told someone in Crane's employ that Frank Wade was planning to visit a lawyer in Mill Haven on the 16th to review the original boundary documents. Harold Briggs had received $20 from one of Crane's men on the 17th, 3 weeks before Frank was shot. Frank had known. He had written the name down in his careful handwriting with the date and the amount, and he had not said anything to Clara because he was not yet ready, because he was still building the case. Because he understood that a man like Victor Crane did not go down through accusation alone, and that Harold Briggs would deny everything without corroboration, and that the corroboration needed to be complete before any of it was useful. She thought of standing in Briggs' general store with $5 silver on the counter and the blood on her dress and the whole room looking away from her. She thought of Briggs pushing the money back with the tips of his fingers. She thought of him saying, perhaps that was the Lord's way of telling her to wait. She felt something move through her that was not quite anger. It was older and colder than anger. It was the sensation of understanding a betrayal fully after the fact with no ability to change what it had cost. Eli said when Garrett comes back, we give him the letter. All of it. Crane, Reed, and Briggs. Your father built a case that covers all three. It will hold in court. She said Frank knew Briggs was feeding information to Crane. He knew for 3 weeks, and he did not tell me. Eli said because he did not want you to do something before he had enough to make it count. She said he knew what kind of woman his daughter was. Eli said he knew exactly what kind of woman his daughter was. He raised her. She looked out across the yard at the smoking ruin of the barn, at Tommy Burke, who had been moved by Eli during a brief lull in the fighting to a position away from the fire where he lay an unconscious, breathing shallow, the wound in his shoulder dark and serious but not immediately fatal. He needed a doctor. He needed one before the morning was much older. She said, I am going to need to visit Tommy Burke when this is over. Eli looked at her. She said he was in that yard because he had no other options. That is not an excuse, but it is a fact. And there are things that need to be said between us, and I would rather say them while he is alive to hear them. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he said, your father's letter. The note at the end. She did not answer right away. He said he knew he had taught you one thing wrong. She looked at the smoke still rising from where the barn had stood. She thought about Frank sitting on the porch with his cold coffee and his careful smile, having already prepared for what he knew was coming. She thought about the words written small in the margin of the final page of his letter pressed against her heart. She said softly, he said, if there was someone worth standing beside, not to push them away just because he had raised me to stand alone. The word was small in the morning air between them. Eli said nothing. Some things do not require a response. They require only the willingness to have been heard. Around them, the valley of Clearwater Creek went about the business of mourning. The cattle in the home pasture had settled after the disturbance of the gunfire. The creek moved quietly through the cottonwoods. A raven called from somewhere above the ridgeline, harsh and carrying the sound echoing down the walls of the valley and fading slowly into the space that the echo left behind. The smoke from the barn thinned as the fire burned itself down to embers. Clara Wade wiped her face with the back of her sleeve and stood up from the porch steps and looked at what remained of her family's land in the early morning light. The house was standing. The cattle were alive. The letter was against her heart. And the man beside her, who had come to Millhaven with no plan and no destination and no reason to stop, was still there. They got Tommy Burke onto a horse, and Clara rode with Seth Holloway to Millhaven, while Eli stayed at the ranch to manage the remaining embers and the frightened livestock. It was a practical division of tasks made without discussion, because they had both become, over the course of the past 16 hours, people who looked at what needed doing and divided it without ceremony. In Millhaven, Dr. Whitmore took Tommy into the back room without asking questions. Seth Holloway tied the horse that was carrying Victor Crane outside the doctor's office and then stood in the street for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then he came to where Clara was standing, and he looked at her directly. He said, "I will tell Garrett everything. When he gets back, everything I saw and everything I did." She looked at him, at the young face with its complicated freight of guilt and relief, and the expression of a person who has just stepped off one side of a line they had been standing on for too long. She said, "I know you will." He said, "I am sorry. For all of it. For what Crane did to your family and for my part in what happened today." She said, "Go get some rest, Seth. We will talk properly when Garrett is back." He nodded. He walked away down the Millhaven street, his boots raising small clouds of dust, with each step carrying himself with the posture of a young man who has just made a decision he will have to spend a lifetime living up to. Clara watched him go. Then she turned and looked at the road that led back north to the ranch, back to the valley of Clearwater Creek, back to the house that was still standing, and the embers of what had once been a barn, and a man who had come from nowhere in particular, and stayed for reasons she was only beginning to understand fully. She remounted her horse. The road home was 15 miles of red Nevada dust, and it had never felt shorter. Sheriff Thomas Garrett rode into Millhaven on the morning of the fourth day. Clara saw him from the kitchen window, recognizable at half a mile by the way he sat, a horse straight-backed and forward, leaning the posture of a man who has spent 30 years in a saddle and made his peace with the fact that the saddle is where most of the important things in his life have happened. His yellow roan moved at a steady trot down the main street, dust rising in small, even puffs from the hooves, and Garrett's eyes were moving over the town with the practiced scan of a man reading a room he has been away from for a week. In that week, the room had changed considerably. The smoke from the Wade barn had been visible from Millhaven for the better part of a morning. Victor Crane lay in the back room of Dr. Whitmore's office with a hole in his thigh and a fever that had climbed for 2 days before it began to descend. 3 of his hired men were in the makeshift jail that was Deputy Roy Pierce's locked storeroom. Harold Briggs had not opened his store in 4 days. And the town of Millhaven had been doing what small towns do when something large and uncomfortable has happened in their immediate vicinity, talking in low voices, avoiding certain subjects in public, and waiting for someone with authority to arrive and tell them what the official version of events was going to be. Garrett tied his horse and went to his office first. He was in there for 20 minutes. Then he came out and rode north. He arrived at the Wade Ranch in the early afternoon when the light was at its full Nevada intensity, and the smoke smell had finally faded from the yard, replaced by the ordinary smell of dust and cattle and cottonwood sap. The ruin of the barn was still visible from the gate, the blackened skeleton of it stark against the blue sky, the collapsed roof beams pointing upward at odd angles like the ribs of something enormous that had lain down and not gotten up. Garrett looked at it for a long moment before he dismounted. He came up the porch steps and stopped at the place where the boards still showed dark. He looked down at it without expression. He had seen enough of this particular color in his career that he no longer flinched at it, but he looked at it with the full attention it deserved, the attention of a man who takes seriously the fact that it represents the end of a person. Then he knocked. They sat at the kitchen table. Garrett, Claire, Eli. The sheriff opened his case folder on the table between them, settled his hat on his knee, and looked at Clara with the expression of a man who has already formed preliminary conclusions and is here to test them against testimony. He said Crane is claiming his men were ambushed, says the fire was accidental. Clara said without inflection, "That is a lie." Garrett said, "I know it is a lie, but I need the full account from you. Everything, in order. Because what you tell me determines what happens next, and what happens next is going to be contested by men with money and a lawyer coming up from San Francisco. Clara placed her father's letter on the table. Garrett looked at it without touching it for a moment. Then he picked it up carefully and began to read. The kitchen was quiet while he read. Outside, the cattle moved in the home pasture with a sound of tearing grass and slow movement. The creek ran its steady course through the cottonwoods. A cloud passed over the sun, and the kitchen went briefly dimmer and then bright again. Garrett read all 3 pages. He read the first page twice. He set the letter down on the table and put one finger on the top edge of it, not pressing. Just resting there as though maintaining contact with it helped him think. He said, "Frank Wade wrote this." Clara said yes. He said he hid it in the rifle so Crane's people would not find it if they searched the house. She said yes. Garrett looked at the second page at the map and the name written there. He said Douglas Reed. He said it slowly, the name sitting in his mouth like something he was deciding what to do with. Douglas Reed had been the county land registrar since 1866. He had a wife and 3 children and a membership in the Methodist Church whose steeple leaned in the wind. He had shaken Garrett's hand at the 4th of July celebration 2 months ago and commented on the weather. Garrett said, "Your father documented all of this over how long a period?" Clara said years. He started keeping records after the Burke well went bad. He knew what Crane was doing. He was building the case the right way through evidence and witnesses because he understood that anything less would not hold in court. Garrett looked at the letter again, at the 3rd page at Frank's handwriting in the lower margin. He did not read that part aloud. He folded the letter carefully along its original creases and set it on the table between them. He said, "This is enough. The witness named Alderman, if he is still in Reno, confirms the Burke well testimony. The track sketch corroborates the Shaw fire. Reed's name with the specifics your father recorded gives us a line into the falsified survey maps. And the Briggs notation." He stopped. He looked up at Clara. He said, "H. Briggs." The silence that followed had a weight that Eli recognized. The silence of a name that has been known by one person for some time and is now being heard by another for the first time. The silence of a burden being transferred between carriers. Clara said Harold Briggs told Crane's people that my father was going to see a lawyer about the boundary documents. 3 weeks before my father was shot. He received $20 from one of Crane's men the following day. Garrett's face did not change in any dramatic way. He was 51 years old, and he had been a lawman for most of his adult life, and his face had learned long ago not to register things that his mind was still working through. But something moved in his eyes, something that was not quite surprise and not quite the absence of surprise. He said Frank knew this. She said Frank documented it. Garrett picked up his hat from his knee and turned it twice in his hands and set it back down. He looked at the table. He said very quietly, "Harold Briggs pushed money back across a counter at you 4 days ago." She said yes. He said, "While your father was dead, 15 miles north." She said yes. The kitchen held that for a moment. Then Garrett stood up and picked up the letter and tucked it into his case folder with the careful handling of a man who understands the weight of paper when paper has been made to carry the right things. He said he needed her full account of the morning of the attack and the morning of the confrontation in sequence with every detail she could recall. He said it would take time. He said it was necessary. Clara told him everything. She told him about the 7 riders coming out of the morning mist, about Crane's offer and her refusal, about Crane coming alone to the porch and the conversation that followed, about the fire and the shooting and Tommy Burke, about Seth Holloway throwing down his rifle and giving his name and his grandfather's name, about Victor Crane on the ground in the dirt of the Wade property with his hands pressed against his own wound. Eli gave his account separately with the precision of a man who had been trained to observe and report dates and positions and sequences, the testimony of someone who knew how testimony was used and constructed accordingly. Garrett wrote everything down. When he was nearly finished, the back door of the kitchen opened and Deputy Roy Pierce came in from the yard. Pierce was 36 years old, transferred to Millhaven 2 weeks ago from the Arizona Territory. A quiet and competent man who had been managing the situation in town while Garrett was in Carson City. He was lean and fair-haired with steady eyes that law work either produces or attracts, and he moved through the kitchen without ceremony and pulled out the chair at the end of the table and sat down. He looked at Eli, and Eli looked at Pierce. The room shifted in a way that Clara felt before she understood it, a change in atmospheric pressure, the way you feel a storm coming before the clouds are visible. Pierce said Hargrove. Eli Hargrove. You rode with the Ranger unit out of San Antonio, under Captain Moore. I know you from Laredo 71. His voice was level, professional. But underneath the professionalism was something older and harder that had been waiting for this conversation for 3 years. Eli looked at him with the expression that Clara had come to understand was not blankness, but rather the full attention of a man who has decided to be completely honest and is organizing his honesty before he delivers it. He said, Pierce. Yes, I remember. Pierce said Ben Caswell, March of 71. You shot him on a Tuesday morning outside the hardware store on Flora Street. Eli said yes. Pierce said the man's son is a friend of mine, has been for 15 years. He told me his father was unarmed when you shot him. The kitchen was entirely quiet now. Garrett had stopped writing. Clara had gone still. Eli said Ben Caswell had a .38 caliber revolver in his right coat pocket when I shot him. There were 2 witnesses present, a man named Cole and a woman named Estrada who ran the laundry 2 doors down. Both of them saw the gun. Both of them gave statements to the Rangers on the day it happened. Pierce said I never saw those statements. Eli said because you were in Arizona territory when the incident was processed internally. The file was closed at the division level. You would need to write to Austin to access the full record. A long silence. Pierce looked at him steadily, the look of a man who has been carrying a version of a story for 3 years and is now being handed a different version and must decide what to do with the conflict between them. He said, if I write to Austin, Eli said you will find 2 signed witness statements in a closed inquiry that fully exonerated the shooting. It is in the record. It has always been in the record. The problem was that you heard the son's account before you ever saw the official file. Pierce said nothing for a moment. Garrett cleared his throat. He said, this is not today's business. Today's business is the Wade Ranch and Victor Crane. Pierce, if there are outstanding questions about anything from 71, they go through official channels and proper procedure, and I will not have them interfering with a current investigation. Pierce looked at Garrett. He looked at Eli. He looked at the table. He said, understood. He stood up and walked back out through the kitchen door into the yard, and the latch clicked behind him with a sound like punctuation. Garrett finished his notes. He tucked the letter carefully back into his folder. He looked at Clara across the table and said what he had come prepared to say. He said, I am going to arrest Harold Briggs this afternoon. She said nothing. He said, I am going to contact Jesse Alderman in Reno and arrange his testimony. I am going to begin the process of charging Victor Crane with the murder of Frank Wade, with arson and criminal destruction of property, and with a pattern of coerced land acquisition going back to the Burke incident in 71. With your father's documentation and Alderman's testimony and Seth Holloway's willingness to testify, the case will hold. He said Reed's name in that letter with the specifics your father recorded gives us grounds to examine the official survey maps. If the alterations are there and from what your father documented, I believe they will be. Then Reed faces charges as well. He picked up his hat and settled it on his head. He said Frank Wade spent years building this quietly without telling anyone, without getting anyone killed, because he understood that the only way to stop a man like Crane permanently was through the law. He was right. What he built in those 3 pages is going to hold up in a Carson City courtroom in a way that no amount of gunfire ever could. He stood up and extended his hand across the table. Clara shook it. He said before he turned to go, your father would be proud of you, Clara. I want you to know that from someone who knew him. He walked out through the front door, and the sound of his horse moving away from the gate was slow and steady and certain. That afternoon, Garrett arrested Harold Briggs. By the account of those who witnessed it, Briggs began crying before Garrett had finished reading the charges. He said he had been afraid. He said Crane had threatened his business, his livelihood, everything he had built. He said he had not known Frank would be killed. He said he had only passed along information, only answered a question when a man who frightened him had asked it. Everything he said was probably true, and none of it changed what it had cost. Briggs General Store closed its doors that afternoon and did not reopen for the duration of the legal proceedings. Ellen Briggs came to the Wade Ranch 2 days later alone in the early evening when the light was going amber over the valley. She knocked on the kitchen door, and when Clara opened it, she stood there with a face that had been crying recently and would probably cry again before the night was over, and she said she was sorry. She said it the way people say it when they mean it, and when meaning it is not enough. And they know it is not enough, and they have come anyway because the alternative was doing nothing at all. Clara listened to her. She did not say I forgive you because she was not ready to say that yet, and she would not say things she did not yet mean. But she said, I hear you, Mrs. Briggs, and she let her stand there in the door a moment longer before she quietly closed it. In Millhaven, the town had begun the long, uncomfortable process of looking at itself. Some people decided Clara Wade was a hero, the woman who held her land when no one would help her, who stood in the door of her own house and refused to move. Some people decided she was dangerous, a woman with a rifle who had shot a man. Some people, the largest group and the quietest, said nothing at all and looked away when she rode into town because looking at her required looking at what they had done. On the afternoon she had stood in Briggs' General Store with her father's blood on her dress and her money on the counter, and every person in the room had found somewhere else to look. The fifth day after the attack, Dale Whitfield arrived at the ranch. He did not come alone. He brought 4 other men, all of them carrying tools, all of them in the posture of people who have decided to do something that they should have done earlier and are embarrassed by the lateness of the doing, but have come regardless. They did not knock on the door. They went directly to the site of the burned barn and began clearing the debris, working in silence, loading the blackened timbers onto a flatbed with the methodical attention of men who understand that work is sometimes the only language available to them. Clara watched them from the kitchen window. She did not go out immediately. She stood at the window and watched Whitfield, who was 70 years old and moved more slowly than the other men, but worked with the careful precision of someone who had been doing physical labor their entire life and had learned to conserve effort without sacrificing quality. Eli came and stood beside her. He said they came to start the rebuild. She said, I know. He said, are you going to let them? She was quiet for a moment. She watched Whitfield pry a blackened beam away from the foundation stones with a long bar, his shoulders working, his feet planted wide. She watched him set the beam aside and move to the next one, steady and unhurried. She said, this is not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. She said, but the barn needs to be built, and I cannot build it alone. And they came. She opened the kitchen door and walked across the yard. Whitfield stopped when he saw her coming. He straightened slowly with the deliberate movement of an old man's joints, and he looked at her with the expression of someone who is prepared to hear whatever they deserve to hear and has decided they will not argue with it. She said, Mr. Whitfield, before we start, I want to know how my grandfather Edmund laid out the original foundation stones. I want to rebuild it the same way. Whitfield's face moved. Something in it shifted towards something that was not quite relief, but was in the direction of relief. His voice when he spoke was rough. He said, I remember every one of them. I was there when he put the first one down. She said, then show me. They walked to the foundation together, and the other men picked up their tools and followed, and the work of rebuilding began. 3 weeks after the attack, when the new barn was framed and rising in the afternoon light, Clara rode into Millhaven and went to Dr. Whitmore's office. Tommy Burke was sitting up in the bed nearest the window. His left arm was in a sling, the wound healing cleanly according to Whitmore, who had said the shot that found him had been placed with a precision that had saved his life rather than ended it, whether by intention or good fortune. Tommy looked at Clara when she came through the door the way a person looks at someone whose presence they have been expecting and dreading in equal measure. She pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. She did not speak immediately. She looked at her hands in her lap for a moment, the way she had seen her father look at his hands when he was thinking carefully about something before he said it. She said, I have nothing to apologize for in the shooting. You were feeding the fire that was burning my grandfather's barn. If I had not stopped you, everything he built was gone. Tommy said nothing. She said, but I am sorry that you were standing in that yard at all. I am sorry that Victor Crane turned you into something you did not choose to be burying. I am sorry that after everything he did to your family, the only work you could find was working for him. That is a cruelty that I do not have words sufficient for. She stopped. Tommy looked out the window at the Millhaven street, at the dust and the ordinary afternoon movement of a small town going about its business. His jaw was tight. He was working with something the way you work with something that has too many pieces to hold all at once. He said, I knew it was your land. When I was out there with that brush pile, I knew whose barn it was and whose grandfather had built it and what I was doing to it. He said, I told myself it was just a building. Just wood. She said it was not just wood. He said, no, it was not. The afternoon light came through the window at an angle that made everything look golden and slightly too still, the light of late summer in Nevada that makes things appear to be remembered rather than currently happening. Clara reached into the pocket of her jacket and placed a folded piece of paper on the bedside table. She stood up. She said, "When you are strong enough to ride, come north. There is work at the ranch if you want it. Fair wages. I will not hold what happened against your labor. That is not how my father operated, and it is not how I intend to operate." She picked up her hat from her knee and put it on. She said, "The choice is yours, Tommy. It always will be." She walked out of the doctor's office and into the Nevada afternoon, and behind her she heard Tommy Burke make a sound that was very small and very quiet. The sound of someone releasing something they had been holding for too long, like water finally allowed to run. The following week, a letter came from Austin. It arrived at Garrett's office, addressed to Deputy Roy Pierce, postmarked 10 days prior, bearing the seal of the Texas Rangers. Pierce read it alone in the office with the door closed. He was in there for 30 minutes. Then he rode out to the Wade Ranch. Eli was splitting wood at the back of the house when Pierce arrived at the rhythmic thwack of the axe carrying across the yard in the dry afternoon air. He stopped when he saw the deputy coming through the gate and set the axe in the chopping block and waited. Pierce dismounted and walked across the yard and stopped a few feet away. He held out the letter. Eli read it without hurrying. Then he folded it along its creases and held it out to Pierce. Pierce said, "Two witnesses, Cole and Estrada, both signed. File closed and sealed inside 2 weeks of the incident. I never saw it because I was in Tucson when it happened and nobody thought to forward it." Eli said no. Pierce said my friend's version of what happened to his father was not the truth. Eli said his son believed it was the truth. Believing something is true and it being true are not always the same thing. Pierce looked at him. He was working with something in his expression, the uncomfortable work of a man who is adjusting his understanding of something he thought he had understood correctly for 3 years. It is not easy work. It does not become easy just because you commit to doing it. He said, "I owe you a correction. I came here believing something about you that was not accurate. I acted on that belief in front of witnesses. I want you to know that I know I was wrong." He said it directly without decoration, without the excessive qualification that turns apologies into exercises in protecting the person giving them rather than respecting the person receiving them. He looked at Eli while he said it. Eli received it without making it larger or smaller than it was. He said, "I appreciate that." He said, "The man whose father it was, your friend, Pierce said he is in a Texas prison. Different matter. Nothing to do with his father or with you." Eli looked at the letter in Pierce's hand for a moment. Then he looked up at the mountains on the north side of the valley, blue and solid in the afternoon. He said then, "I hope he finds his way out. Whatever he did, he lost his father young and without the truth of it. That is a hard thing to carry." Pierce looked at him for a moment longer. Something passed through his expression that was in the neighborhood of respect, the kind that takes a while to arrive and is worth more for the waiting. He said, "I will write the corrected record to the Rangers, document that the statements were on file and that the case was properly closed." Eli said, "I would appreciate that too." Pierce put the letter in his coat pocket and mounted his horse. He touched the brim of his hat, once deliberate and formal, and rode back down the road toward Millhaven. Eli watched him go until the dust settled. Then he went back to the wood and picked up the axe and continued splitting, the clean sound of it resuming its rhythm in the afternoon air, as though nothing particularly large had just been resolved. The trial of Victor Crane took place in Carson City in late October of 1874. It lasted 4 days. The San Francisco lawyer Crane had retained was skilled and thorough and did everything that could be done with the material available to him, which was less than what he had hoped when he arrived. Frank Wade's letter was entered into evidence. Jesse Alderman traveled from Reno and gave his testimony about the night of March 8, 1871, the well and the man he had seen there. The testimony was specific, unhurried, and backed by the sketch of the location that Frank had included in his documentation. Seth Holloway took the stand and testified to everything he had witnessed and everything he had participated in, including the order given to set the fire at the Wade barn and the instruction given to him the morning of the attack. His voice did not waver. He had decided before he sat down in that chair what kind of man he was going to be in that room, and he was it. Harold Briggs testified in exchange for a reduced sentence. He gave names and dates and amounts of money, the detailed testimony of a man who had been keeping an internal record of his own transgressions for some time, perhaps against the day when keeping them inside would become more costly than releasing them. Victor Crane sat straight throughout. When the verdict was read, he did not flinch, and he did not speak, and he did not make any gesture that could be interpreted as either denial or remorse. He received the outcome of his choices with the same composure with which he had pursued those choices, which was perhaps the most honest thing he had done in a very long time. Life imprisonment, no possibility of parole, complete forfeiture of all improperly acquired properties to be distributed to the original owners or their heirs by order of the court. Douglas Reed received 2 years of hard labor and permanent revocation of his right to hold public office. The corrected survey maps were filed within 30 days of the verdict. Harold Briggs received 3 years of hard labor. He and Ellen left Millhaven the month after he completed his sentence and were not heard from again in that part of Nevada. The Burke land, the Shaw land, the Vega land, all of it went back to the families it had been taken from, or to what remained of those families scattered and changed as they were by the years of displacement. Some came back, some had gone too far in other directions to return. But the land waited for them, indifferent to their absence, in the way that land always is patient, in the way that only very old things can afford to be. The autumn of 1874 came to the valley of Clearwater Creek the way it always did, slowly and without apology. The cottonwoods went gold. The temperature dropped a degree each day, imperceptible individually and unmistakable in accumulation. The cattle grew their winter coats. The creek ran clear and cold and high from the early rains. The new barn rose through September and stood finished by the first week of October, its pine boards pale and clean against the old weathered silver of the house, taller than Edmund's barn had been, and built on the same foundation stones in the same configuration, because Whitfield had remembered every one of them. On the day it was finished, Clara walked through it from one end to the other and stood in the center with the smell of new wood all around her and the light coming in through the upper vents in long, dusty columns, and she stood there for a long time without speaking. She was thinking about Edmund, about the 8 men who had come to this valley together, 7 of whom had left or died, about the decision that one man had made to stay when staying was the harder choice. She was thinking about what it meant to be the continuation of that decision. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, the last of the garden was being put to bed. Clara was in the rows near the back of the house harvesting the final tomatoes before the frost could reach them. They were the last fruit of the season, skin thin and tight, deep red and heavy, the way things become at the end of their time, when all the growing is done and what remains is purely what the season made. She heard his footsteps on the garden path and did not look up. Eli stopped at the edge of the row hat in both hands, turning the brim the way she had first seen him do outside the Briggs General Store on the afternoon that had changed everything. He said, "Clara." She looked up. He said, "I came to Nevada with no destination and no plan. I was just moving because stopping felt wrong, and I did not know yet what stopping right would feel like. Then I watched you walk out of that store with your father's blood on your dress and 5 silver dollars in your fist and fire in your eyes, and I understood something that I had not understood since January." He said, "You were the reason to stop." He went down on one knee in the garden dirt. The earth was cool and damp under him. He held his hat in one hand and looked up at her with the expression that was not softness exactly, but was the complete absence of the guard that he usually kept in place, everything stripped back to what was actually there underneath all of it. He said, "I love you, Clara Wade. Not the idea of you, not the story of you. You, the way you ride, the way you argue, the way you went to Tommy Burke's bedside and said the hard true thing instead of the easy false one. The way you still reach for the rifle in the night, even when there is no rifle there. I love all of it, all of what this year has made you, and all of what you were before I knew you." He said, "Will you marry me?" The garden was very still around them. A hawk made a slow circle above the cottonwoods. The creek made its sound in the distance. Clara looked at him. She held a tomato in her hand and she looked at this man who had come from nowhere with no reason to stay and had given her every reason to believe him when he said the simple, irreducible things that mattered. She said, "From the moment you came out from under that porch overhang with your hat in your hands and you told me about your mother, Ada, from that moment I knew you were the kind of man worth knowing. I did not let myself know it fully then, because I had other things to do. But I knew it. She said yes. She stepped forward and put both hands on either side of his face, garden soil still on her fingers, and she kissed him in the October afternoon, with the new barn rising behind them and the cottonwoods going gold on the hillside above the graves of everyone they had both loved and lost and were still in their different ways in conversation with. 40 years passed. The barn was expanded twice. The cattle herd grew to 180 head. The house gained a wing on the east side when the children were young, and a wide porch on the south side when the children were grown and the grandchildren needed somewhere to run. The creek ran and ran and ran, patient and unchanged, carrying the snowmelt down from the mountains in the spring and running low and clear in the late summer heat, the way it had run since before Edmund Wade had ever seen it. Nathan Hargrove was born in 1875, the oldest of three, broad-shouldered and quiet in the manner of his father, with his mother's direct gaze that missed very little. Emma Hargrove came in 1877, and she had Clara's way of looking at a problem from all sides before she committed to an approach, and Eli's rare but genuine smile that, when it came, made the room feel warmer. Lily Hargrove arrived in 1880, and she was the sharp one, the one who wanted numbers and precision, who went to the University of Nevada in 1898 and came back with an accounting degree, one of the first women in the state to hold one. When people expressed surprise at a woman in that role, Lily had a way of looking at them that her mother had taught her without knowing she was teaching it. The look that said, "I hear what you are saying, and I have decided not to find it interesting." In 1878, there had been a child who did not survive. A small grave under the cottonwood joined the three already there. This was the grief that Clara and Eli did not talk about with many people, the one they carried in a different compartment than the others, deeper and more private, the one that had changed something between them in a way that deepened rather than diminished what they had. Seth Holloway had turned his testimony into a life. He worked honest work, saved honest money, and by 1882 had enough to put a down payment on 200 acres north of Millhaven. He had a wife he loved, 5 children who were becoming people he admired, and a reputation in the valley that he had built one day at a time over the 20 years since he threw his rifle into the dirt of the Wade yard and decided what kind of man he was going to be. He was not a perfect man. He had never claimed to be. But he was consistent, and consistency over time is how ordinary men build legacies that last beyond them. On the evening of the 40th anniversary, nearly 100 people gathered in the yard of the Wade Hargrove Ranch under strings of lanterns that Nathan had hung between the cottonwoods that afternoon. Tables covered in white cloth ran the length of the yard. There was beef and cornbread and apple pie, still warm from the oven, and enough conversation to fill the valley and spill over the ridgelines. Clara and Eli sat on the old wooden bench under the largest cottonwood on the rise above the yard and looking down at the gathering below. The posture of two old people who have earned the right to observe rather than participate, though they would both go down there before the evening was done. His hand was on hers. Her fingers were through his. 40 years of this arrangement of two people's hands so practiced that it happened without either of them noticing the way breathing happens. She was 66. Her hair had gone white, and she wore it loose at the back in the evenings. Now the practical knot of the working day released when the day was done. Her back was as straight as it had been at 26. Her eyes had not changed at all. He was 73. His hair had gone white years ago, early the way his mother's had. The lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened into something that read, depending on the light, as wisdom or as tiredness, and were actually both. Below them among the gathering, Seth Holloway stood up. The conversations quieted around him one by one, the way sound quiets in rooms when someone is about to say something that the room understands it needs to hear. Seth was 60 years old. His hair showed gray at the temples. The years of outdoor work had carved his face into something weathered and honest, the face of a man who had not tried to protect himself from the consequences of living fully. He said, "I joined Victor Crane's outfit when I was 20 years old." No preamble, no softening. The room was completely quiet now. He said, "My grandfather was Martin Burke. Victor Crane poisoned our family's well in 1871 and started the destruction that eventually left us with nothing. I went to work for the man who ruined my family because there was nobody else hiring and 3 younger siblings who needed to eat. I know that is not a sufficient reason. I am not offering it as one." He looked up the slope toward the bench where Clara and Eli sat. He said 40 years ago on a morning in August, two people on that bench had every right to treat me as an enemy and none at all to treat me at anything better. The woman I had come to help burn out looked at me in her yard and said, "Go, Seth. Make sure he reaches the doctor." No judgment, no conditions. He said, "I have spent 40 years trying to understand what it cost her to say that. And I think I finally understand it. It did not cost her nothing. People who say forgiveness is easy have never had to give it when it mattered. It cost her something she decided was worth spending." He said, "Everything good in my life, my wife, my children, this land I have worked for 20 years and will pass to my children. Every morning I have woken up and been able to look at myself in a mirror. It starts from that morning, from two people who chose something harder than what they were entitled to choose." He picked up his glass. He said to Clara and Eli Hargrove, "The best people I have ever known." The yard rang with voices and the sound of glass and the sound of people expressing things that did not easily reduce to words and so came out as sound instead. Nathan put his arm around his wife. Emma leaned into her husband's shoulder. Lily raised her glass from the far table with the precise and certain motion of a woman who is comfortable in her own authority. A small girl ran up the slope from the yard and grabbed the hem of Clara's skirt. 6 years old, Emma's oldest daughter, with eyes that held the quality of children who pay attention to more than adults realize. She looked up and said, "Grandma, why is Mr. Seth crying?" Clara lifted the child onto her lap. She held her against her chest in the gathering dark and looked down at the lantern-lit yard and the gathered faces of everyone who had come from the choices that had been made on an August morning 4 decades ago. She said because he is remembering something that happened a long time ago that makes him happy. The child said, "You cry when you are happy." Clara said sometimes the happiest thing and the saddest thing are the same thing, just looked at from different directions. The child thought about this with the seriousness that children bring to things they have decided are important. Then she settled back against Clara's chest and looked out at the lanterns. Dinner time. Later, after the last of the guests had gone in or gone home, and the children who would not sleep had been carried to their beds and the yard was quiet in the way that yards are quiet after celebration, Nathan came into the kitchen carrying Clara's old Winchester. He placed it on the kitchen table. He sat down across from his parents and looked at the rifle in the lamplight. He said, "Mother, I have wanted to ask about this since I was a boy, and you always change the subject." He pointed to the stock near the grip where two marks had been cut into the wood. One long and straight, one short and angled. He said, "The two notches. What are they?" Clara looked at the rifle, the same Winchester she had carried on her back into Briggs General Store with her father's blood on her dress. The same rifle she had fired through the kitchen window on a morning in August 1874. The same rifle that had lain beside her on the bed through 100 nights of the first years of their marriage, a reflex holdover from those early days when waking in the night and reaching for it was still something her body did before her mind could intervene. She looked at Eli. He gave the small nod, the one that had no drama in it, the one that was just acknowledgement. She said the long one. "I cut that the afternoon of the day I shot a man for the first time in my life. Not to mark a victory, not to record anything I was proud of, to make sure I never forgot what it cost. The people who talk about those things as though they are simple have not done them. They are not simple. I wanted to look at that mark every time I picked up that rifle and remember that." Nathan said, "And the other one?" She looked at Eli. He looked at the rifle on the table. He looked at his hands, which were old, now the skin thin across the knuckles, the veins more visible, the hands of a man who had done a great deal of physical work over a great many years. He said, "I put that one there. The same afternoon. She saw me do it, and she asked why." He paused. In the kitchen behind them, Emma had appeared in the doorway without either of them noticing. Lily stood beside Myrn. He said, "I told her that what she was carrying, I wanted to carry some part of it too. That whatever she bore from that day forward, I wanted to share the weight of it, even if I could only take a fraction. I wanted there to be something on that rifle that said, you did not do this alone, and you will not carry it alone." The kitchen held that sentence the way a room holds music after the last note has been played, the sound gone but the shape of it remaining in the air. Nathan sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the rifle and did not speak for a long time. Chico. They went up the hill together before bed. They always did this on the nights that mattered. Not every night, but the important ones, the ones with too much in them to bring inside and go to sleep, The ones that needed the open air and the dark and the Nevada sky without moon. 4 graves under the cottonwood. Ruth Wade, Frank Wade, Edmund Wade, and the small one that had no name on the marker, just a date in 1878, in a carved shape that Clara had asked Eli to cut the shape of a bird in flight wings open, going somewhere the eye could not quite follow. Each grave had fresh flowers. Emma and Lily had placed them in the morning, and they were still open in the evening air, small and particular in the dark. Clara and Eli sat on the bench. His hand found hers in the way it had been finding hers for 40 years, without thought, without effort, the way water finds the shape of whatever holds it. She said, I do not regret any of it, not any choice I made, but the cost of it. The cost never fully goes away. She put her other hand over her chest. She said 40 years and I still feel it here. Some nights more than others. His grip tightened. He said, I do too. Every day of those 40 years I have felt the weight of that morning. And every day of those 40 years, or I may have been glad of every choice that led me to be standing in it beside you. She leaned her head against his shoulder the way she had been leaning it against his shoulder since October of 1874, the angle of it exactly right, the way things are when they have been practiced long enough to become permanent. He looked up at the sky. The Nevada stars had not changed. They were exactly as numerous and exactly as indifferent and exactly as beautiful as they had been on the August night before the fight, when he had sat alone in the kitchen, listening to the sound of Clearwater Creek and the distant sound of men camped in the hills waiting for morning to become what it was going to become. He said very quietly, I had no plan to stop in Millhaven. She said, I know. He said, I am glad I stopped. She said, so am I. Below them, the lights of the ranch moved and settled as the last of the family found their way to sleep. The lanterns in the yard went out one by one. The cottonwood moved in the late night air, its leaves making the sound they always made, the sound that was almost language and was not the sound of something very old, simply continuing. The creek ran in the dark below the house. The stars turned overhead with their enormous patience. And on the hill above the valley that Edmund Wade had decided was worth staying, for 2 old people sat with their hands together and listened to the night and said nothing more because nothing more needed to be said. Some things are finished when they are finished, and this was one of them.